So my name's Will Samson. I'm the youth, young adults and other things pastor from Wynnum Baptist. I've been there full time for 4 years. I've been running the youth group there since 2012. So prior to that, did some time in Townsville working with a lot of outreach ministry, and prior to that I wasn't a Christian, so that sort of worked through nicely. Charles has asked me to share a bit today about this idea of the compassionate priest. What does that look like? What does that mean? And it's probably something that's it is something that's very close to my heart. So I was born in a place called Marsden. If you don't know what that is, remember that a few years back there was a school that threw a sandwich at the Prime Minister and it hit her in the face? Well, that was my high school. So that probably says all you need to know about Marsden. It's between Park Ridge and Woodridge. And I grew up in a very dysfunctional home. My father's been restored to me now, and he and I have a great relationship, but probably prior to me being about 25, 26, that wasn't the case. And so I grew up in an environment with a lot of violence, and because of that I probably grew up accordingly. And through my teenage years I found myself hanging around with the undesirables, we'll call them. And so we ran around the countryside building race cars and racing motorcycles and financing that through whatever means, legal or otherwise, that we could. And it's being recorded, so I'm going to leave that conversation there. For me, I've always considered myself a very spiritual person. Through my teenage years, I met a girl who was into witchcraft and the occult, and so I followed that road for a very long time. Actually, right up until the night I became a Christian. And so when I was 24 years old, which was a long time ago now, I was invited to church during a time of great difficulty for myself. I was actually quite suicidal. I had planned my suicide for that following Tuesday when my mum would be at work and I could get access to my brothers and my rifle safe. And this girl who I thought was particularly attractive invited me to church, and I thought, well, there's probably no better way to get a girl than to go to what she likes. And so I went to church. And there was actually a student from Malyon, everything comes full circle, who was preaching that night. She preached on the book of Job. And it hit me like an absolute train that this man who had lost everything the way that I had, I'd had a time of mental illness, I'd lost all of my friends, I'd lost all of my money, and my response was that life wasn't worth living, and Job's response was to praise this God. And the contrast of our lives together, that just hit me. And so I became a Christian that night, which was really nerve-wracking because no one explained Jesus to me. So I just was convinced that I was going to hell for a week until someone actually told me the good news. And I very much to this day remember it as why it is called the good news, because when I heard that I could be saved from my sin, the relief that I felt in that was tremendous. So I caused merry havoc at Wynnum Baptist for a couple of years after becoming a Christian. I was suspended from youth ministry more times than I can count. I was called before the pastors. We had a baptism about a week after I became a Christian. I celebrated that the way all bikers celebrate a baptism. I popped a tyre in the car park on my motorcycle. I thought that's what we did. That was explained to me that's not what we do. And we had a lot of those conversations. And in about 2007, early 2007, a friend of mine pulled me aside and said, "Will, you're really going nowhere. You should do something. Why don't you go on YWAM?" And I thought, that sounds like a terrible idea. I've heard nothing but bad things about YWAM. But another friend said, "Well, what about GDT?" which was something that put together by Global Interaction. So I found myself in Townsville, was going to be there for 5 months, met a girl, stayed for 3 and a bit years. And while we were there, we did a lot of skate park ministry and a lot of just community outreach stuff. And this is where I realised that this world is full of people just like me, whose dads threw them through walls and whose families didn't understand them, and who were so brought into surviving in a worldly manner that they could never look past themselves, or if they did, they simply sought things that gave them power, which is the whole notion behind the occult. There's the whole notion behind the New Age movement of restoring themselves. Came back to Brisbane, got married, and one of the pastors from Wynnum pulled me aside and said, okay, you're where we can use you, go to Bible college. And then I inflicted myself on poor Charles for about 3.5 years. While we're in that time, Charles may not remember, but I believe the first time I did this, he pointed out that he knew I was right for this role because of the number of assignments I handed in late, because I'd say to him, no, we're helping this family, I don't have time for my assignment. I'm very proud to say I never abused that excuse. I'm not as proud of how seriously I took my Bible education at the time, but it seems to have worked out okay. I am rarely pulled up for heresy in sermons, so it's gone well. That's basically my story. At the moment, I still serve at Wynnum. I went back there from Townsville. I've lived with my wife, my long-suffering wife, and my 2.5-year-old daughter. I am speaking with a little bit of a lisp today because she decided to give Daddy a couple of lip piercings with her forehead last night. So excuse if I sound just a little bit funny. But that's basically my role. And Wynnum is a funny beast, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but it is the blending of two cultures at the moment. We have a lot of people in our church who are second and third generation Christians. Their grandparents are in the church with their parents. And then we have a lot of people, and a growing number of people in our church, we're wearing singlets, shoeless, with tattoos and the appropriate language. And I joyfully sit back and watch that culture come together on occasion. And so our ministry is a 50-50 split. We tend to work a lot with the church families that are struggling to understand life outside of Christendom. They've grown up in such a strong Christian environment, it's very hard for them to understand, even Christians like me. And there are other, we work a lot as well with families who otherwise would not receive any help. So we have a food ministry, and we have a lot of impromptu meetings with parents who don't know how to handle their kids that come to youth group anymore. So that's kind of our role. Almost all of the growth in our church over the last, if I can work my phone with one finger, I can't, I'll have to stop, there we go. Almost all of the growth in our church in the young adult and youth component has come over the last 7 years from people coming in from the community. We currently have 21 youth leaders, of whom 17 have come out of our youth group. And of those 17, I think 14 of them weren't Christians when they first came to youth. So we have had a blessing from the Lord in that area. So I'm just going to go through the bits that Charles has asked me to share, because I've learned over the years that doing what Charles asks is often very wise. And then I'll open up for you guys at the end if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to chat about them. So Charles has asked me to share about the challenges of being the compassionate priest. So what we mean by the compassionate priest is anyone here going into pastoral ministry? I'm going to pray for you later, okay? You guys, who's active in youth ministry at the moment? Okay, so you guys know it's really easy to go in with the Bible, grab the Christian kids, show them in the Bible where all their problems line up and walk away. And you can do that, and you can actually, I believe, that you can do that and actually run what would appear to be quite a successful ministry. But the church that does that is one generation away from failure. And so you will die out. You need to go into the community, you need to find people that don't know Jesus, and you need to help them to find a position where the Spirit can speak. Because the reality is, in the world at the moment, most people, like my vision of God, it took a sledgehammer to get through to me, and it still does. But I was not in a position to hear God. It took a sermon that I am utterly convinced God prepared for me to hear that night. It took a girl who had given me unconditional friendship for 6 months to invite me. And when I got there, I had these strange people. I learned later they were Christians, but they were coming up and they were hugging me and saying, "It's so great to have you here. Welcome." And I was a lot skinnier back then and a lot less crippled, and I was sporting a mohawk and a very bad attitude, and people were trying to hug me. It was weird. It's still weird to this day. But it took that change. And so when we talk about the compassionate priest, I personally, in my life, view that role as the person who was willing to be the bridge between a person and God, and the area that they work in is the pain and the difficulty in a person's life that prevents them from being open to the gospel. You know, you come up to someone and say, come and believe in Jesus, he's a good father. If you say that to me, my memory of my father, I don't want to know a dad. I don't want another dad. I do now. My dad's awesome. Great man, terrible parent. But I would not have connected with that. And so for me, the compassionate priest is the person who finds the angle that God wants to work to bring a blessing out of the existing pain in somebody's life. God works all things for good. And so he takes those things that have been damaging, and he uses believers who are submitted to him to bring a new light on those, to view the gospel from a different angle. That's the compassionate priest. So what are the challenges of fulfilling that role? Well, number one, it's going to break your heart. This is the big thing. You need to know this right at the start. A lot of people will hear the word of the Lord. A lot of people will take your time. They can't take it because you give it, right? No one can take from you what you give freely. But they will work with you, live with you, talk with you, and then when push comes to shove, they will cling to the pain, they'll cling to the old way, they'll cling to the suffering, and they'll disappear. And it's like losing a friend every time. Because you can't not love them. If you don't love them, you're not really being compassionate, you're just being this weird, clingy guy. But if you do love them, and when you realise that a lot of people just can't get past that, it will break your heart. The good news is a lot of them come back, okay? And most of them will come back 2 or 3 times before something will change and click. You just got to write the round about it. It'll come good one day. But you got to be ready for the fact that it will break your heart. And most of the people you work with probably won't see through the process completely. That's okay, because some will. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but some will. So go into it knowing that if you do it in your own strength, and you do it because it's going to make you feel good, you will have a spectacular ministry that will be very short. And the path of the compassionate priest is littered with people who flame out way too quickly by going all in themselves. It's got to be God through you, it's got to be the Spirit through you, or it won't last. Now the next one, this is a funny thing, and I didn't talk about this last time because I had 2 more years in ministry since then, but you have to, one of the risks of it is becoming hard. And it's going to sound really funny, but to do this role well, you must have boundaries. You have to establish boundaries. You cannot call me at 11 o'clock at night. Okay, that's not appropriate, here's why. And it's really, really, really easy to fall into that habit of just establishing these hard and fast boundaries that protect you and they keep the ministry rolling, and they're beautiful things. But my experience now is that the real growth can happen when you need to move the boundaries just a little bit here and there, and it's never the same rule for each person. And so for a little while, I would say maybe about 18 months ago, I went through a period where I was really struggling to connect with people. What I realised is I had established this wall of professionalism that I had designed to protect me in my tiredness, and that was really no good because people couldn't see me through that wall. And what we're building is intimacy. And I can't remember the guy's name. There's a great video on marriage, and the guy describes intimacy as in to me see. I want you to see into me, to see who I am, and to see how I love you. And that's how we establish intimacy with someone. Obviously, different intimacy with different people. I'm not going to be intimate with someone the way I'm intimate with my wife, but I'm also not going to be intimate with a stranger the way I would be with someone I'm trying to love on. And when you put up a wall, no one can see into you, and you can't establish that intimacy. So you will have to be aware that you are dancing this ever-changing game of letting people in and out of different places in your life to keep them where they need to be, that you can walk beside them, because they walk some really funny places, really strange places that they will take you. Church culture is going to be a big thing you will face. Okay, You're going to bring someone to church, their mobile phone's going to go off. You're going to bring someone to church, and when their mobile phone goes off, they're going to answer it. It's going to be their ex-wife, their ex-husband, their estranged whatever, the dude who stole their dog. I've had all of these things happen. And they're going to answer it with an F-bomb at full volume in the middle of the foyer about 5 minutes before church starts. And the interesting thing is when that happens, the congregation will not look at the F-bomber. They will stare straight at you because you are the one who has brought this uncomfortable mess into their midst. They don't mean to do it. Don't ever, ever, ever buy into thinking that your church is this horrible monster that can't accept the broken. People aren't, I don't think people are scared of change, they're scared of loss. And when you bring in someone who is so different to the outside of the church, they fear that they're going to lose what it is that drew them to that place in the first place. And so they might lose the safety for their kids, they might lose the safety for them, they might be uncomfortable, they might not want to hear these words. Your church is going to go through different stages with this. If you do this you have this continual flow of new youth kids, new young adults, the families that come with those. I've had families pull their Christian kids out of our youth group because there were too many community kids. I've had families tell me they won't send their kids to our youth group from inside the church until we get leaders who are from the church and at least 50 years old heading the youth group. Christians, I've witnessed their faith, I've worked with them and worshipped with them and prayed with them, but if you have a ministry of compassionate priests and if you are a youth leader, do not build this on your own, build this into your leaders. A team doing this is incredible, but you will face these burdens. So just be aware that you will have to navigate this through your church. And I say this to you, I say this straight up now, if you are doing this walk, be upfront with your leadership. If you've got these people coming in, talk to your pastors, talk to your elders, whatever your church structure is, and say, hey, I'm letting you know this person's coming in. Keep them aware, keep them talking about it, keep them involved in it, and they'll want to be a part of it. They've just got to be gently encouraged sometimes. Burnout. I've had a range of calamities in my life. I raced motorcycles for a long time, so I carry a lot of injury. And I've been sick a lot in my life. And I found out this time last year, actually, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue. And when I look back at the 6 months leading up to that, I will be the first to admit I was not being responsible in my workload. I was trying to fit in a massive amount of outreach into a massive amount of church development, into a new baby or a toddler, into a marriage, into I kind of skipped that bit. We have an adopted daughter. She came in our youth ministry when she was about 15. Her mum is unsuitable for a parent and her dad is absent. And she's lived with us ever since. A couple of weeks ago we got her 14-year-old sister because she couldn't live with mum anymore either. But trying to look after her and raise her and help that family, and I just got sick. Now I would still say that even though I'm managing my chronic fatigue really well, I am tired. I just met with Dave Benson and we were talking about missional communities a little bit, and he looked at me and said, you look tired, and he was absolutely right. And I take full responsibility for that. I did not follow the advice I would give to you guys about pacing yourself. Christ told us we will always have the poor with us. You cannot save everyone, you cannot save, in fact you can't save anyone. They've got to want to change. But you are not called to be successful in any way, shape or form. You are called to be faithful, and being faithful means doing it for 50, 60, 70 years. You guys are all young, you've got heaps of time left. Flaming out in 5 years, it just creates a blip on the church radar and disappears. You create a movement of people over a 10-year period that is sustained, and then you get the 10 people that you brought in over those 10 years and get them to make another 10, and then that 20 go out, and you've actually built something that will be a blip on 8 church radars as you plant 8 different churches over the next 50 years from the people that you've grown. You absolutely have to pace yourself, you cannot risk burnout, and you need to self-care. If you're tired, the moment a big one for me is someone who's really painful will bring up. and say, hey, I need to see you. And if I get that feeling of like, I really wish I hadn't answered that phone call, something's wrong, and I've got to backtrack and look after yourself. Do not burn out. It is the biggest killer of pastors everywhere. That brings us to the last one, the martyr complex. You are not Jesus. You cannot save everybody. Nothing hangs on you. If you die tomorrow, Jesus will find someone else and move on. Okay? This is the way it works. You're going to go in heaven with him. He'll tap someone else on the shoulder and move on. Don't think this all rides on you. And one of the best things to do with that, I really encourage you guys, is work in team. And I have an Amy. Okay? You should get an Amy. They might have a different name, but they need to have the same personality. Amy keeps me humble on levels that are almost disturbing. But I will say something and she'll just whisper in the ear and she'll be like, okay, Pastor Jesus. Just to remind me, like, hey, you probably overstepped your boundaries right there. Have someone who is prepared to give you a hard word when you are being hard-headed, and it will protect you from burnout a long way. If you are in a relationship, talk with your partner, and all of you talk with your leader. If you're youth workers, talk with your youth pastor. If you're youth pastors, talk with your senior or your elder or your mentor or whatever. But make sure someone is keeping an eye on what you're doing, and that someone is prepared to say to you, hey, you're probably taking on the entire gospel on your shoulders, because that is a massive killer. Blessings. I'll give you an idea of a blessing. We have this girl living with us. She's lived with us since she was 15. She's 21. And we got a phone call one night that her sister's stepdad had done something really silly. Police were involved. There was violence involved. And all of a sudden we have this 14-year-old girl living with us. A girl who, when I met her, her older sister that we've had for a while, couldn't see past the end of her own nose. It would not occur to her to be generous in any way, shape or form. I will confidently say, and I've said this, we talk about this a lot, but she was, when we met her, probably the most self-focused person I've ever met. And she cleared her study desk out of her room. She got another bed from another family, put a second bed in the room. There was no talk about putting her sister in the lounge room. There was no talk about anything. It was just, she just grabbed this girl and loved on her the way Jesus would. Her and her sister are not the closest friends. And I realized that by being a community and opening my family up to this girl, we had completely rewritten her DNA. She was more selfless in that than I was. I was trying to work out how this was going to affect me and weigh up how I needed to balance that with my family. And here's our eldest daughter just pouring. You will see that change in people's lives. And you never take credit for it because you didn't do it. The Holy Spirit did it. But Jesus gives you the joy of being a part of that journey, and he gives you the joy of seeing it happen. And you can't buy that. You can't get that feeling anywhere. That is God's kingdom on earth. Is this the heart of change people that grow in that? Oh man. So this is where I get my little like, it's just so good when you see people, you see kids change, you see families change, you see kids reunited. You see the power of the gospel move in people's lives and change them in a way that changes them, the community around them, the family around them, and it's incredible. The other thing I find the blessing of being in a role like this is that it keeps you connected to the gospel in a way that's very real. There's a survey done of pastors a little while back, and I think it was like over 60% had no non-Christian friends. Like I call it breaking out of Jesus land, which I get in trouble for, but whatever. But you got to. If you're in the city, prostitutes are everywhere. You can talk to them. They usually like it when you hand them a gospel tract because it means you'll talk to them and not talk about anything else. What the gospel is and how much power it has to change. And there's no better way to stay connected to my God than to realize what he's doing around me in every moment of every day in people who otherwise wouldn't see him. Your community will grow from this as well. No church is good inbreeding on its DNA when the grandkid of this kid marries the grandkid of this kid, and the church is like a funnel and it just keeps getting narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower until it peters out. When you bring in these strange new people and you add them in, you add a life to the church, you make the church deal with issues that it wouldn't have otherwise dealt with. And if handled well, the role of the compassionate priest can bring a new life to a church that it wouldn't know any other way. And you can use it to build a missional community out of your church that actually sees the Great Commission become a realised reality in people's lives. Where I think for a lot of people nowadays it's a bit of a guilt trip. They constantly wonder, am I doing this well enough? When you're sitting next to someone who's just reformed from their drug use and you spend the entire relapse, you realise that, yep, we are going out to make disciples of all nations here. Future of this role, I think it's going to become more important as we leave Christendom behind. As people become more and more defined by their feelings, if you're more defined by your feelings, you become more defined by your pain. The boundaries between the cross and the average person are growing. And it's not growing in the way people think. Everyone's fearful of the scientific atheist. Massively small part of the population. The biggest objections to the church today is around things like homosexuality. Almost, it's like everyone talks about it, but no one really sees them. You are far more likely to meet people who just have never been loved in their entire life. And when you do it unconditionally, Dave Benson said something recently that's been kicking around my head, and I'm going to misquote him a little bit, but I know he'll forgive me. But he was talking about evangelism. And he said some of the most effective evangelism happens when we do radical acts of kingdom love that cause people to ask questions that can only be answered by the gospel. If you love people in a way that they look at you and you know you're on the money when you hear this question, why are you doing this? Why are you loving me like this? And you can answer them in no other way than say, because Jesus would have it no other way in my life. I love you because he loves you. You bring change. And I think the more and more pain-filled society, social media will make sure that happens, the media will make sure that happens. They actually create a rod for their own back because they give us a leverage point to show people that Jesus loves in a society that is more and more defined by not loving. And I think that the role of the compassionate priest is going to be exponentially important in a more and more painful society, particularly with teenagers. They're like little sponges. They just absorb every single bit of hate the world puts out for them, and then you come along as the only piece of light they've got that actually gives unconditional love. And for a lot of the kids in the community, that's a reality. So your generation, I feel old saying that, but your generation will face challenges that we never did, but you will face opportunities that we could never dream of. Because by being yourself and letting Christ shine through you, you will be a light to the world. So